I'm a little more skeptical of. Just because
You're not a skeptic. You believe everything.
there's issues with, if you're going to use a floating hydrometer,
then champagne yeast.
Check 1, 2.
Because it smells like it'll be sweet.
You know,
It's
it's
not.
a lot better than the test
55
I did with that
seconds.
Play-Doh thing, which was
55
just sugar
seconds
and water and
to audio.
Tell the roll.
add the alien.
Start.
All of it.
It was
Start.
55 seconds, Brandon.
Okay, I'll be right back. 44.
Gotta make it really quick. Like, really, really quick.
Everybody's armed, right?
We are armed, right?
I'm arming them right now. I don't know what's what, but we're arming all of them.
Do it.
Do it.
No, there's no point in closing that. None. None skis.
Yeah, it's not very good.
Can
but
hear you.
the idea is there.
Well, it's tea. It's gonna have that.
Yeah.
Chuk, chuk, chuk.
I'm sure if I had
3,
actually used honey
2,
for it.
1, go.
Music, maestro.
I hit record. You not hearing anything?
No.
Yeah.
The Human Torch was denied a bank loan.
Is the volume not up?
It's up, but I don't see nothing. Nothing's playing.
Is anything recording?
I don't know. Can't tell.
Here comes the blend, and something's falling out of it. What are those?
Come look at it. Oh, hey.
Oh my god. Oh, the humanity.
Oh, no, it's playing there, but it's not. There's no music. That's the difference.
We need music. I refuse to work without music.
This?
No.
I'm seeing the presents.
So it is recording because we're further down. Oh, we're at like the 2 hour and 17 point.
So he's not
It's-
set up.
Hit like stop. And I hit that where you just were.
This is going flawlessly. I like it.
The one with the bar.
Starting to think this is
Now,
like a
you
government
can hit it
operation
again,
here.
We'll start from there.
All right, I don't think.
Yeah, we're on, dude.
We'll just we'll cover over it. Welcome back to Come and Brew It Radio, coming to you from Texas Brewing Inc. in Haltom City, Texas. You can find us on the web at txbrewing.com and be sure to follow us on Facebook and share with your friends.
In this episode, we're going to cover the findings for beer clarity that we missed out in the last episode. We get plenty of questions from listeners and customers about how to get the clearest beer in their glass, and this, so we wanted to talk about a few ways to get that really clear beer. Woo! Plus, we'll dig into our next Belgian style by discussing Category 25A, the Belgian Blonde, and Category 26A, the Abbey Single style of beer.
Before we get started, please be sure to check out our Patreon account to help support the show. Every little bit counts, and if you visit patreon.com/commonbrewradio, we have a variety of options for you to help keep the show going, get involved, and improve it. Plus, we'd like to thank James Rodriguez for becoming a patron.
Thank you, James.
Thanks, James.
I'm Chris.
I'm Greg.
I'm Brandon.
Zach's in the studio.
I'm Zach.
Zach is behind the window.
Zach.
Yes.
I'm Zach.
All right. Well, that was as smooth as a stucco bathtub.
Stubby was supposed to have this set up.
Well, it's not like we didn't have an hour to sit here and rehearse this if we wanted
Oh,
to.
wait.
You
We
know.
just
Wait,
drinking
we're
beer
supposed
for
to be
most of that.
rehearsing?
Yeah. We did have our
Yeah.
priorities in order. We were drinking beer and saying stupid things, but at any rate, welcome back. We've got a good show. We've got a little bit of a skeleton crew tonight. Not a lot of people, but that's
Right.
fine because we do have some good stuff to talk about. That's all that matters.
Yeah,
The real talent showed up.
something like that.
Something.
Yeah,
like
we're
that.
going to
That's
recover
I'm gonna
what
tell
we
myself.
missed out on last week. That's going to be our start off point, and then we get into some more styles just to keep going with those. But let's see. First of all, our recent happenings. Something that came out, was that today or yesterday, with Anchor being bought by
I believe that
Sapporo
was yesterday.
yesterday.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. At first, I made a bunch of snide, angry comments about it, but actually, the more I think about it, the more it doesn't bother me that much. I don't
Because
like,
it's Sapporo.
yeah, because it's not some big, ridiculous, horrible company. It's Sapporo.
Right.
I don't like the idea of Anchor being sold at all, so I was never going to like the news.
Of course.
But at least I can still buy it and drink it with a clear conscience.
And I always felt like that company kind of floats out there on its own in the craft universe for so many years.
Yes,
It's been out there on its
exactly.
own and alone. So it's like, who knows? I don't know what to say about something like that. But the fact that it was a company like Sapporo buying it is a lot better than AB InBev or You know,
Well,
some
if
of the
someone
other
was
things
going to
that-
buy it, it wasn't going to be an American company. The big companies that are buying people out are not American, and so that was a given. But that's kind of the rub for me is that's a true American craft beer brand. They were widely credited for reviving craft beer in America, and to me, that's a true. True American brand of beer, and for it to be owned by the Japanese just kind of rubs me the wrong way a little bit. But
the beer is now spread internationally where it wasn't as much before.
Yeah,
so.
and this is a case of the narrative you always hear from these guys about, well, the beer's not going to change and the recipes aren't going to change and all that, and they're saying all that same thing that everybody's always said. In this case, if that's true, if they leave the brewery alone, but they're just going to produce more and maybe brew it in Japan to be distributed in Japan or something like that, I don't have a problem with that.
You could buy an Anchor beer, Anchor Steam, Anchor Port, or something like that.
Yeah.
Or even barley wine overseas for like probably a third of the cost it would be were it imported.
Well, and let's face it,
For all
a
you
lot of their
travelers.
styles don't travel well. They don't store well. Anchor Steam in particular, you have to get that beer fresh or it's not very good. It's one of my very favorite beers when you can get it fresh. That's in my top 5. I love Anchor Steam. But when it's not, it just does not age well and it doesn't travel well. So, we'll see. That's one I'm willing to reserve.
I'm curious,
judgment.
out of all of it, if we're still going to see everybody continuing their standard tradition of buying the Christmas ales and holding them back and having tiered servings of those, at certain points of the...
Well, one thing I'll say about this is you didn't see any real outcry.
No. There's not been well, it just happened yesterday, too.
Yeah, but Wicked Weed took all of about 24 hours, and the whole universe came crashing down on their head. And rightfully so, I think. I'm not arguing that, but it happened quick. With this one, I think everybody's... I think I probably have the same type of reaction as most people. Like, they don't like that it's sold, but we don't know if selling to Sapporo is a good thing or a bad thing yet.
Right. Not gonna
Or if
it's
it's
going to have to shake out on this one.
It might be nothing at all.
Versus what you know is bad.
Right.
Definitely bad.
How big is Sapporo, really?
Well, that's what I was going to ask. I don't know how big Sapporo
I've
is.
had Sapporo several times, but the only places I ever find it are at sushi restaurants, and it's tasty beer.
For a reason.
But usually all the other beers are 12 ounces, and theirs are 22, so I assume they're very big because they're bigger than
either that or
Eastern
beers.
Company. It's probably very dominant as far as that goes.
I know a lot of the companies that are in the Asian Pacific Rim are serving in larger bottles because you get a big bottle, you get a frozen glass, and you pour over the frozen glass to drink it.
Okay. What is Zach doing?
I don't know. He's distracting all of us.
He is.
The train of thought just derailed. Yeah.
I'm very uneasy right now.
I think that's a good deal, though. I mean, if you could see that happening with Anchor overseas, I always just think, like, I haven't been overseas, so I'm not sure. I hear a lot of stories about people going and usually being pretty disappointed with what they can get.
Yeah.
And if they can suddenly have the Anchor lineup overseas versus, like, in any place in the eastern portion of, in urine, then, at least there's that versus the typical, adjunct beers. That's pretty much what they're the most common. So
I imagine if they start producing it in Japan, it's probably going to open up a whole nother line in Japan of different kinds of beers, because the kinds of beers they're serving over in Asia primarily are, regular lager beers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
maybe
that's a very good point. Yeah. Imagine if it takes off over there.
Watch what Anchor does. It started a craft movement here. It goes over there, some big company gets it, they buy it, and then suddenly you see a whole lot more craft breweries popping up internationally.
That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah,
I think.
that's another spark. That'd be good. Go Anchor. For once, maybe it's not bad.
Like if
news,
Anchor goes over to Japan and just drops a massive bomb of craft beer.
Yeah, it just opens up.
Too soon. That was wrong. I feel bad for that one, but... So anyway, we'll see. I'll reserve judgment on that one. The main thing is, as long as the American operations don't change, as long as that iconic brewery that's there in San Francisco stays what it is, and they're still making the same beers,
it deserves respect.
Yeah,
much more than the new guys that immediately sold out. So.
Right. And the press release I read said they talked to quote unquote many large breweries other than Sapporo. So one of them was AB InBev. So if that's the case, I'm sure glad it wasn't that.
Right.
If Wicked Weed didn't show up there and go, "What the hell, bro? You got to sign, bro." And
all the cool kids are doing
it. All the cool kids. You want to be really punk rock.
You got to sell out first.
Yeah.
The other good thing that we saw this week was passed around was the y'all know this one better than I do. You've already looked into it because you both want one.
Well, I
The
was,
I need
can and
an
soda
AR
can
first.
launcher?
Yeah, the can and soda can launcher.
I was surprised this just made the rounds with y'all. That y'all hadn't seen it before, honestly.
Oh, really? Well, I'm not
I'm
not
rifles.
as into guns as others may be, and this is actually an upper for an AR-15. You put this
Correct.
onto a functioning rifle.
Correct. So this can be bought online and shipped to you because it's not a rifle. It's considered to be
Right.
a piece.
Yeah, and what I read is that it's not even regulated the same way as any. Once you put this on the AR, that is not considered a weapon anymore.
Technically.
Yeah. So
Technically,
I
with
mean,
an
it's the
AR
first time someone gets shot in the gourd with it and goes to the hospital. I think it'll probably change. But for those of you who don't know what we're talking about, this is the can cannon is an upper for an AR-15 that converts it to shoot 12 or 16 ounce cans using 5.56 blank ammo.
Correct.
And it'll shoot a 12 ounce can 105 yards.
Yep.
I don't know why you'd want to do that.
Crowd control
Yeah.
Stadiums.
at the parties,
I imagine you'd roll a T-shirt about the same size as well.
Oh yeah. Well, still, somebody cold beer right here.
My eye!
Well, the video I saw, the can exploded about all the way towards the end of the arc. So I mean,
Oh.
Oh, it did?
Yeah.
Because what I was reading is that it doesn't hurt the integrity of the can at all. So it must then if the thing exploded before it ever
It
even
depends
landed.
on which end.
Well,
you
he shook
put
the
it
can up
into it.
first too. He shook the can up, so that's what
Okay.
matters.
The first time I saw this was on Demolition Ranch
Mm-hmm.
on YouTube, and he plays with it. He plays with things, and he took 12-ounce cans of generic soda, and then he put beer in it, and then he put tall boys of beer in it, and then he went, "Where's the dog? I wonder if tennis balls will fit in this. I wonder if 2 tennis balls will fit in this. Will it fire 3 tennis balls? It will fire 3 tennis balls. Not
We've
as well as
learned.
2 and not as well as 1. But you can play fetch with it. Just don't do it
Run,
in city
dog, run.
limits.
Well, I wonder if you could take this thing and put a beer in it and shoot a deer in the head and say, I wasn't hunting the deer. We were just having a beer and he keeled over.
Right.
And so I know
Yeah.
it's March, but
Well,
I'm going to take this
We're
deer.
in Texas.
Yeah.
That-
The majority of the population has an AR-15.
That
Let
won't
it go.
work in Texas if the game warden shows up. Let me tell you, because
That's what I'm wondering.
You're
Yeah.
not allowed to take
No, wait.
roadkill deer. They do not. They count against hunting.
Right. Well, this isn't roadkill. You and the deer
know,
were
but-
sharing a beer. He tragically met his end.
He
I was
fumbled
I was
and didn't catch it,
transporting him for medical attention.
and then ended up at the taxidermist and the butcher.
Right,
exactly.
Tragic story, really.
I think the best option for this could just be going turkey hunting.
Yeah,
And you have like
probably.
beer can turkey. Yeah. You
Yeah.
just
Oh,
start
that's
right
true.
there.
Huh? It just goes right up there.
Right-
and-
right up, you're
yeah,
done.
You got to wait for him to turn his back. And,
Everything is right there. But moving on. Another thing
Alright.
this week that came out, if you're an AHA member, you might have noticed that they sent out the Mead Day, the 2017 Mead Day announcement. And if you look closely at that, the
which is
recipe that
this weekend, right?
This weekend.
Yeah.
Saturday.
and it's this weekend. It's going to be the official recipe is the Buckwheat Buffalo Traditional Mead by our own James Lalonde, Grandmaster James Lalonde here from our Metroplex. That's what we tried on air. If you listen to our episode with him about meads, we actually drank that one on air. He talked quite a bit about it. So
That
if-
was the mead that made the longest lasting impression on me,
Yeah.
personally.
well, I mean, that's the mead that like he won with this, and it's an intense beverage, that one. So
Personally, I would advise if you haven't tried that before to take the same recipe and use a different varietal of honey until you have
Definitely-
an opportunity to
definitely
try.
try
Strong.
buckwheat honey before you make 5
Yeah.
gallons of it, because if you don't like it, you may not like that. But I will say with this, not liking the buckwheat, going into it knowing I didn't like it, trying that mead and drinking about a quarter cup of it, it totally grew on me and won me over. By the end of it, it's like it just took a minute to convince me that, hey, this really is quite tasty. So it's one of those things. If you can make something, if you can follow his recipe and turn out a product that was that good and won a gold at NHC, it's going to be a good mead. So, just switch out the honey if you have to, but it's still a great recipe. So cheers to James for having that recipe for this year's mead day.
It was a big win for him. He had been trying to win an award with mead for a while. And I had been over his house before he submitted those, and he was like, this is the year, man, I'm doing it. I really, really set out to do it. And then he went and won a gold.
Right.
And I know it was a very big deal for him. And so that to have happened and then to take his recipe and put it out there like this is really a big deal. James, more than anybody I know, gives so much of his time to people who want to learn to do things, whether it's judging or brewing or making mead or anything like that. He is one of the most gracious people I've ever met with his time.
Right.
And so I like to see when he gets some recognition like this because he has put in countless hours just helping other people
many years
do better. Yeah, many years of it, yeah. So,
and if we're lucky,
congratulations.
actually, we talked to James and hoping we maybe have some branch-off shows at some point in the future that's more specific to BJCP that he's going to be the host of, and we'll find out about that. We'll give you all an announcement when it happens. So.
Yeah, that'd be great. There's no one better to learn from than him. I'm convinced of it.
And he gives big, sloppy hugs and kisses, too. It's so if you meet him in person, just go ahead and grab one.
It's a little alarming when you first meet him.
Yeah. I don't know. I think you, like Mikey, you can successfully ward those off if you're careful.
Good luck.
They've been at a minimum for me. So.
Good luck.
I'm not a hugger. I don't like that stuff. So.
Oh, that's so sad.
Hey, I saved my hugs for the dark. All right.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Is that where they belong?
that's
Yeah,
even
right?
that's creepy, actually. Keep the
it's
lights
kinda-
on.
it's
Keep
meant
the
to be a
lights on,
little
everyone.
creepy, yeah.
But yeah, so in our last episode, we didn't get a chance to get to it because we had a lot of good discussion going on and whatnot. But we were going to talk about beer findings for clarity. And I think that this is a subject area that, honestly, I've probably found more brewers that once they're getting their methods down that they have more of a concern about a clear beer over anything else. See, like that's something to me. I'll drink if the beer's good, I don't care about the clarity so much. I care about it for competition, things like that, and I care about it if it's supposed to be really clean. But
see, to me, this is one that there is, just like you say, it was kind of an arc in my brewing process before it became important to me. And once I decided, okay, it's important to me to get these beers clear, and I've done things to take those steps. I personally think that most styles are a lot better if you get them clear. And we'll talk about what makes them hazy. And to me, if it's in there, it makes a difference. Now, we could do a triangle test probably, and it would come up inconclusive. But it's the difference between something like that and you're brewing a beer that you're going to spend some time with. If you're brewing 5 gallons of beer, you're going to be drinking that a lot at your house, and you're going to get intimately familiar with that beer, and you're going to start noticing the little things that could have been a little bit better. And I think clarity comes up there. And then also, if you have people over that you're serving your beer to that are not beer nerds, and
they're used to
they're not used to it.
Clear
Let me
beer.
tell you, handing them a clear beer is a completely different thing because that's what they know beer to be.
Absolutely.
And we eat and we drink with our eyes. We do, whether we like it or not. And so if you hand a beer to somebody who's not a beer nerd like us, and it's nice and crystal clear, you're already halfway there to them.
Right. They're not scared of
an open mind and liking it. So personally, I really, really like making sure my beer is as clear as possible.
I've definitely noticed that as a newer brewer.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, I didn't care, didn't even notice it, but the clearer and less cloudy my beers have been, the more I've liked them.
Which is what you'll always find when you keg beers too. Usually you start off, you blow off whatever precipitate falls out of that over time in the keg. Even if you put it in the first place and it was pretty clear, there's still going to be something left, especially if the keg gets shaken up. But you knock some more of it out, and that beer that starts off, say it's 3 weeks old when you keg it, and then about a week after that, you're thinking this is pretty good. The beer's clear every time I pour it, or more or less. And then about a month later, you're still pouring it, and it's gotten a lot more clear, and the flavor's usually a lot better.
Yeah.
Barring maybe IPAs, which might be losing a little bit of the hop character or something like that. So.
Yeah, about halfway through a keg, you start to absolutely love something. And
Yeah,
go,
right.
What was I missing to begin with?
I mean, especially for lagers, that they only get better, and that's giving it time to clarify and taste better.
To me, that's a testament to the difference that, having all of that, whatever's in there making it hazy, and we're going to get into that in just a second, having that not in there makes a difference. And it's not something that you might notice on the first drink, or like I was saying, in a triangle test might be difficult. But when you're going to sit down and have several pints of something, you're going to spend some time with a beer over a period of however long it takes you to drink the keg, and you really start to pick out the little things that you do and don't like about it. I think it makes a big difference, and a lot of people will tell you they like the last part of their keg better,
Right.
and that's why.
And that doesn't, I mean, it applies to all beers too.
Yeah.
It's not just, golden colored see-through type of beer. It could stand to a porter or a stout even.
Absolutely.
Clarity also can mean you may not be able to see through it, it may be opaque, but everything has fallen out of solution after some time, and it's a better beer because of that a lot of times. So,
The other thing too is if you're ever going to transport your beer, if it's kegged and you're going to take it to something, if it goes into the keg, if everything you put into the keg is perfectly clear, it's not going to matter that you put it in your car and drove it somewhere and took it out. It's going to be clear again when you start to serve it. If you put it in the keg and it's got things that make it cloudy and they drop out just because it's cold, the first time you move that even an inch, you got cloudy beer again. So
and it can stay cloudy afterwards for your
for
whole
a while,
night of serving, unless it's just absolutely cold as hell wherever you put that thing. So
let's get into the reasons that beer is hazy or cloudy, I should say. I get this New England IPA thing. You get the word hazy stuck in your head.
Haze is the word that it works. I mean, the most for that.
So the reasons all have different effects on the flavor and whether or not, and the mouthfeel, and whether or not it makes a difference in what your beer tastes like. So there's some hazes that aren't going to make as much of a difference as others.
Right.
You have listed here permanent haze, Greg. What do you mean by that?
The permanent haze, basically, as far as that biological contamination, kind of things like, or excess starch. Those are usually the two reasons for something that's become permanent that you're not going to be able to get rid of in the beer. Contamination could be bacteria. A lot of times that gets in there and you see PDO can leave a lot of stuff in there for a while. Mm-hmm. If it gets in there, there are other things that are less friendly to the beverage as far as flavors go that can leave a lot of haze in there over time. And then there's, of course, excess starch, which is probably pretty common to a lot of first-time all-grain brewers and whatnot. If the starch wasn't converted, if you were, or even for an extract brewer, if you were steeping and you had a lot of starchy adjunct grains in there and you had nothing to help convert it while you steeped, like it should be more of a partial mash.
That's
in
a
those
very
terms,
good point, yeah.
You're going to have a beer that's going to turn out being more like, you're something that you wanted to be absolutely clear could now be like that Northeast IPA because it leaves those starches behind, that kind of thing that just didn't get converted. And
unmalted wheat, if you're using a recipe that's got unmalted wheat, that'll leave a lot of those starches in there. That's a really good point on the extract with steeping grains. I hadn't thought about that before.
It happens a lot for a lot of people from what I've seen. So, and you can't
what would be a good
get that
example,
out as easy with the findings. So.
I think is some of those kits come with Munich in the grains. And Munich is a base malt, and you do need to steep that in mash temperature ranges, not at 165 or whatever, 168. Like we should differentiate there because what exactly are we talking about in terms of, extract with steeping grains and mini mash? So there can be extract with steeping grains where it's, obviously dry or liquid extract. And then the grains that come in it would be maybe roasted barley,
caramel
malts, things like that are just there to put flavor in. Non-fermentables.
Color and flavor only.
Right. Yeah. And I think when you get into the lower caramels, you have to count those kind of as a base malt because they do have some fermentable sugar in them. And so if you've got those kits where the vast majority of your fermentables are coming from the extract or sugar or something like that, or honey, you don't need to worry so much about that. And you'll, when I first started brewing extract, the recipes all said steep at like 165,
right?
Something like
don't almost let it get 170,
right? Which is literally just steeping. You're just making a tea. If you have base grains in there, anything that's got starches that need to be converted, whether it's regular two-row, whether it's Munich, Vienna, the lower caramel malts, that kind of thing, you can steep in the 150 range. You're still going to steep just like you would at 165. I don't know that you have any less extraction at that temperature. But what you're going to do is convert those starches into fermentable sugars. And like Greg is saying, instead of just rinsing starches out of these things and not converting them, you're going to actually convert them, and they're not going to be left in your beer.
Right.
Not only is that going to affect the clarity, it's going to affect the taste and the mouthfeel and everything. It's going to, if you've got those base grains in there, they need to be converted, or it's going to have a negative effect on your beer.
Right. And I think in general, it's just it's a better practice to for any steeping, especially if it has excess amount of grains in it that aren't just the typicals, like we said, to go ahead and put it at about 150 to 155, somewhere in there, because you'll get more out of it no matter what. And if there are fermentables that you're just adding to, so do that every time, and you'll end up with a cleaner end product.
Now, it should be noted that if you do have haze from these things that we're talking about, or cloudiness from these things, there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah,
pretty
much.
That's why it was labeled permanent haze when we started here, is that you're not going to find it out. You're not going to cold crash it out. Maybe you could filter it out if you had a sophisticated filtering system, but chances are, if you're that advanced, you're not having that problem to begin with. So.
And you're going to see that coming. I mean, the starches are going to be from the beginning. You might see a slight change, but not enough to really warrant to say, oh, I executed on this and I won. It's not going to be like that. Contamination, on the other hand, more likely going to be something that's already in your bottled end product, and every time you pour it, it's I'm too late. There's nothing to do. So
So the most common one, and the one that's the easiest to deal with, is yeast haze. And this is one thing that newer brewers out there, as you're getting your feet under you and you're really starting to pay attention to what you're doing with your yeast, you should look at descriptions of what that particular strain of yeast you're using is, and look at is it flocculation?
Flocculation.
Look at what the flocculation is on it, because some yeasts just don't want to drop out. A lot of yeast don't want to drop out. So when you look at your yeast that you're using and it says it's highly flocculent, that means that when it's done doing what it's going to do, it
clumps
pulls
up
together into clumps, and then it falls out. And English yeasts are notorious for that. It's a good thing and a bad thing. If you manage your fermentation correctly, it's good,
right?
Because it drops out and it's nice and clear. If you don't manage your fermentation correctly, it'll drop out before it's done doing what it's doing. You'll
have too much
left
sweetness,
with diacetyl and sweetness and that kind of thing. But there are some very common yeast, the Cal Ale yeast, 1056, WLP 001, or US05, which are all the same strain. That's a very powdery yeast.
Yeah.
And when you see powdery in the description, that means that it does not want to clump together and does not want to flocculate, and it'll stay in suspension. And there's ways to get it out, but it's not going to just do it on its own.
Right. Like powdery, I think the best example would be something like a wit beer yeast. The Belgians, of course, but the wit beer, because there aren't any really clear wit beers. It should always have that haze, and that's usually from the yeast and the wheat and whatnot. That, but the yeast is a big component of that, and it's the flavor, Weizen, Hefeweizen. But like for those beers, you don't want that to drop out.
Right.
For everything else, pretty much, you want it to see knocked out over time. I mean, with those other type of beers, you're shaking up your bottles and your kegs to get it back in solution. But with
my experience with US05 or the Cal Ale yeast is that they're every bit as powdery as those Weizen and wheat beer yeasts and stuff like. They're hard to get out of suspension,
and they're easily kicked up. You could cold crash. We'll talk about that, but like you could do that and move the container, and it kicks up several inches of it in the bottom. Yeah, and then you've got to deal with that. So or let it settle before you transfer things like that.
So why don't you want yeast haze in there? What are the adverse effects it has on it? Well, one of them is just what we talked about, just the appearance. To me, the appearance is important, and it might not be to all brewers. It's one of those things that maybe it's on your checklist and you haven't gotten there yet because you're still dealing with fundamentals. You're still just trying to make sure that your hot side stuff you do on schedule, you keep your sanitation right, and you keep your fermentation managed, and you're trying to get a handle on that. Finding yeast that's in suspension later may not be an important thing to you, but once it is, in my mind, that appearance by itself is important if you're going to be sharing your beer with other people. I think one of the best things about home brewing is giving your beer to somebody who's not a home brewer or not a beer nerd, and having them enjoy it. That's when you feel like you've really done something, when you're just the average person who's not into craft beer goes, man, you made that? That's really good.
You should start a brewery.
Yeah. And we talked about that last week with Barrett when we were talking about the labor of love, that to me, there's something about giving a beer to somebody who's not a beer drinker or having them enjoy it. And clarity, yeast clarity in particular, is a big part of that. So to me, that's real important. The other thing is it'll affect the mouthfeel quite a bit.
Oh yeah, yeah. And you'll have flavor components too, but the mouthfeel.
Yeah.
I mean, the density of yeast is probably the strongest mouthfeel component change out of most of what you're going to find in beer.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that people who are not craft beer drinkers get hung up on too. They don't like something that's got a thick mouthfeel to it.
Right.
That's kind of a stigma about craft beer that's been out there for a long time, that it's thick, and
soupy.
You know, they're used to beers that are very light, very refreshing, thirst quenching. It's hot outside, I want to have a beer kind of beer, and you give them something that they're like,
Yeah.
you can feel it coat your teeth.
Yeah.
The
The yeast
yeast in
sticks
particular
around.
coating your teeth. You can feel it between your teeth.
Yep.
That to me, I had a New England IPA that was one of these that looks like a yeast starter, and you could feel it between your teeth. And to
Right.
me, I'm like, that ruins it for me. And that's what the non-craft beer drinker feels like when you give them a beer full of yeast.
And then they associate that with craft brew.
or even worse, with homebrew.
Yeah.
You know, because that's
those
the
are
other
all
big
bad.
thing. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what you're going to find the most. And it also can mean a lot of times if you have that in your beer, it can also mean that your beer's not ready for packaging yet.
That's
in
true,
whatever
yeah.
form, so it's still too young. It may still be doing what it's doing because you might be getting all flavors in there, not just because that you can taste what the actual yeast in solution, but they're still cleaning up things that are in solution that aren't out of it yet. So like maybe you're pushing something. you
Right,
know?
right, and that's one of the reasons it's important to be familiar with the properties of the yeast that you're using and know how flocculent it is. If you're using an English yeast and there's still a bunch of yeast in suspension, don't touch it.
Yeah.
That is still doing something if it's still in suspension. If it hasn't dropped out, because yeast or English yeast just drops out so quickly. It's one of the great things about it, and that's a good indicator. It's a visual indicator you can use to know, leave this alone. I always hate when I see these basic instructions for early homebrewers. You know, pitch your yeast in 7 days, put it in the secondary. You know, it's such an arbitrary time period. You just don't know if it's actually doing
Right.
anything, or if it's still in active fermentation, or if it's still cleaning up after itself. And so if you're using an English yeast and it's cloudy, let it sit. And hopefully it will. If it doesn't clear up, that might go back to the first thing we talked about, where,
Right,
where it's
right.
infected or something. Yeah.
Right. And it should. I mean, generally, time's going to clear that out anyway. So mainly, you're not giving it enough time unless it's specific to the style, in which case you want to keep some of it in there. Make sure that when you're transferring, if you're going to a keg or a bottling bucket and it's a Hefeweizen, make sure some of that yeast goes with
Yeah,
it. Because
definitely.
you want it in solution and you want it in each bottle to have an equal amount. So when that bottle's rolled, typically, whenever it's being served, that's going to be torn back up. It's going to have that character that you want in it. It's going to be more evenly distributed and whatnot. So,
Mikey's calling you out. He says you stole his spot, dude. You were invited, Mikey. There's an empty mic here right now.
If he really wanted to be here, he'd be here.
That's
and
true.
Obviously, I wanted it more.
he wanted to put his
Uh-oh.
beard hair on your mic. That's what he said he's doing right now. He's just rubbing it in.
It's got its own yeast haze.
That's what we can do next time.
Oh, it's such yeastiness. So the last one would be chill haze.
And chill haze is a pretty common thing. Chill
This is
haze,
a judging area thing often enough.
yeah, it is. And chill haze is one of those that there's a couple different opinions on there about whether you can or can't get rid of it and how it goes away. It's basically caused by proteins in the beer that bond to polyphenols when it gets cold. So if you've had a beer that you had in the fermenter, yeast dropped out, it looked perfectly clear when you put it in your keg or your bottles, and then you pour it and it's hazy, not cloudy, but just hazy, just a little hard to see through. That's typically a protein haze, or chill haze.
Right.
is the other word for it.
And it goes away when the beer warms up typically too.
It does.
Typically.
It also will go away with given enough time, because the proteins bonding with polyphenols. Polyphenols are very large compounds, and they will settle out over time. There's also some debate I've heard on whether or not certain fining agents will take them out. We'll
Right.
get into that when we get into those.
And we
fining
cover
agents.
some of that, yeah.
Yeah, but that's another reason why the last part of your keg might be clearer than the first part, is just that eventually polyphenols will drop out of beer. You know, if it's a beer like an IPA or a wheat beer or something like that you are want to drink quick, you're probably never going to get there.
And then there's this obvious style that it kind of focuses on having a lot of polyphenols in there. The Northeast IPA. I mean,
Right.
honestly,
well,
that's
any
yeah.
IPA that
Yeah.
can be a problem because polyphenols come from hops.
Yep.
And if you're doing a lot of dry hopping, you end up with a lot of polyphenols in your beer. And some IPAs are just going to be cloudy unless you filter them.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently, chill haze can become a more permanent fixture if you have it, warms up, gets cold, warms up, gets cold, warms up, gets cold, and it continues in that cycle. Then it's said that it can become more permanent.
Chances are, if you're doing that too, you're already ruining the beer
Yeah,
overall. The haze
exactly.
is not going to be your main concern. That's incredibly bad for beer stability, to get it cold and then warm and then cold and then
Exactly.
warm. So just don't do that to begin with.
Exactly.
So of those three, I think you're going to have three different completely effects on your beer. And that's why it's important when you talk about hazy beer, and we get into this with the New England IPAs too. To talk about hazy or cloudy beer is really a broad term. It's not descriptive enough to talk about what you're talking about. You need to know why. Why is it hazy or cloudy?
Right.
And I'll go back to the New England IPAs that, when we had the guys from Turning Point in here, they had two different examples in here. One was it was opaque. And it was because they had just a ton of flaked adjuncts and stuff like that in it, and that's just going to cause it to be that way. Another one had a lot of lactose in it, and it was a little clearer, but it also had a lot of hops and some polyphenols and that kind of thing. And
Which
then,
is usually the aim for those. More
Right,
the
it is.
polyphenols, yeah.
And then I've had others that literally were like drinking a yeast starter, and that is
I've had homebrew that was like that. So
Yeah, yeah.
Not intentionally.
and that's a whole different. Those are three completely different set of circumstances and three completely different effects that they're going to have on the beer. Like the flaked adjuncts and that kind of thing. They're going to affect the mouthfeel some, but it's not going to be grainy. You're not going to feel it on your
Right.
teeth or anything like that. It's going to be more of like a little bit fuller, slicker mouthfeel.
Yes.
It's an intentional thing. It's why you're putting oats and that kind of thing into beer. When you have polyphenols, I don't know that has much effect at all. I don't know if that has much effect at all as far as mouthfeel or flavor.
There might be a tannic effect.
Yeah, maybe
you might
some
get
tannins.
that
Yeah.
sort of like not puckering, but it's similar to that on the back of your tongue. That prickly kind of
astringent.
Yeah,
A
astringent,
very
yeah.
slight astringency. Yeah. And then yeast. We've talked at length already about what yeast does. There's a flavor component to it. There's a mouthfeel component. There's a physical feel component to it. To me, yeast haze is the most inexcusable reason to
Right.
have cloudiness and the easiest one to take care of.
right.
So you just need to be able to identify where it's coming from, and then you'll know how to deal with it, and you get into the methods for how you get rid of that.
And to start that, I mean, the real place to really get going with making sure that you're going to have a good, nice, clear beer at the end of it, you're going to start actually with your brew day. I mean, you're going to start with your malt bill and your pH. The pH of, like, if you're mashing in, you're doing all grain batch, then you're using low protein malts. You got a nice pH for that mash, the correct range 5.2 to 5.4. That's going to make a big difference on what you're actually pulling out of that mash on that day to affect it. Like we said, if you're going to have a good conversion of a lot and not have those starches left over, that's a big deal to the first part of that. Or even with an extract batch, same thing. Make sure that everything's on board whenever you're doing that. And if it's going to be something that you don't want those starches left over, then make sure that you've done the right thing when you're steeping in. You're coming closer to mashing than just, steeping tea, in other words. Other than that, you're also going to think about having an appropriate boil, appropriately vigorous, but not overdone, not to caramelize it, that kind of thing.
But
60 to 90 minutes typically, but
by vigorous, do you mean like really bubbling, boiling,
or
dry?
rolling over?
Right.
Rolling over and active, that's
And
not
actually,
just fizzy.
this is a case where the effect can tell you whether or not you're vigorous enough. In other words, the reason you want that good vigorous boil is to coagulate proteins and
Exactly. Hot break.
see that hot break.
Okay.
And if you don't
The
see
egg
hot
drop
break,
soup.
chances are you're not boiling vigorously enough. So if you're on a stove and you're getting it to what you're pretty sure is a boil. You're measuring the temperature. That looks like it's boiling. There's a little bit of activity, but you're not getting that egg drop soup kind of look to it.
Or at least a whole lot of just material.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know?
that wasn't there before.
Right.
Yeah, then that's a sign that you're not boiling vigorously enough.
Okay.
So that's a very basic, easy thing that should be applied to any beer that you do, regardless of how clear you want it to be or
Right.
not.
Because when you have that, the hop break is what's going to fall out at the end of the boil when you're chilling and everything. That's more of the protein that's falling out, so therefore there's less haze in your finished product.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's the same, too, with adding, a fining addition to the boil, like Whirlflock, Irish Moss, depending on what you're into or what you're interested as far as that goes. It's going to help more fall out of solution in the end when you're chilling it, and then a good fast cold break.
Yeah.
Or a good fast chill to get the cold break so
Yeah.
that even more of that coagulates and drops.
Yeah, so
before you
basically,
transfer
you're
it.
just wanting to get all of those protein solids to stick together, become large, and fall to the bottom.
Which is a big deal in the hot side of the process.
It is, yeah. Yeah, and it's funny. We make a big deal of a lot of different things on the hot side, all kinds of mash techniques and all of that. This might be one of the most important things that you could pay attention to on the hot side, is
Right.
making sure that you're getting good hot break and cold break, and that you're using Irish Moss or Whirlflock. And personally, I don't know why anybody uses Irish Moss at all. Whirlflock is the way
traditional.
I
Yeah.
use Irish moss. Just saying.
to go. Why do you use that instead of Whirlflock?
You're wrong.
Because I used Whirlflock one time, and then I went to dump the trube at the end of the boil.
Okay.
And there was the full Whirlflock tab sitting.
Really?
Yeah, so I just won't use it anymore.
Oh, really?
It's
Huh.
weird.
Every
Did-
time I've seen someone use it, they break it up before they toss it in.
Well, I was still a new brewer then.
Most of the time you toss it in, I immediately see it disintegrate.
It's like putting Alka-Seltzer in there. You get a
Yeah.
little like fountain come up. Yeah, that's odd. I've never heard of that before.
I'm sure it happens though.
So
Yeah.
if there really is, in terms of what you're putting into your beer, no difference. The active ingredient in Irish Moss is carrageenan. That's what helps the protein coagulate. And Whirlflock is just a pelletized form of carrageenan. So you're putting the same active ingredient in. Irish
Pre-measured,
Moss just looks
yeah.
like a bunch of oregano.
Yeah.
And
But it's
or,
Irish.
you know,
But
like
don't use
like
it
the
like
bag
that.
of oregano my mom found in my dresser drawer when I was in high school. And then Whirlflock just looks
Don't
like
use that like that as findings.
No,
either.
no, don't do that
No,
either.
That's a late edition.
You definitely wait for after the boil for that addition.
Yeah.
So I want to go back here to low protein malts and an appropriate pH. The malts in particular is one. We've talked a lot recently about these IREX malts that
Right.
Stubby is bringing in, and everybody who's listening should watch for those to appear on the site. I'm sure there's going to be an email sent out when they come in. I know it's on the way. That's one of the things that I really, really like about that malt is you can tell that it's very low protein. I'm very big on making sure that I mash out and recirculate my mash, and the equivalent for like a cooler brewer would be vorlofting very, very well,
Right.
to make sure that you use the grain bed as a filter to pull out a lot of the proteins and that kind of thing, so that when you're running off into your kettle, you're getting clear wort. I've never had wort anywhere near as clear as I have with IREX malt. I think
When
it's
I
just
had
a very
the-
low protein malt.
The Pilsner I use, definitely. I mean, that stuff amazed me about
Yeah,
how clear
yeah,
it
the
was,
Pilsner in
so.
particular, yeah.
And Pilsner's one too that typically you'll have a huge amount of hot break with it. It's just that kind of malt because I guess it's just that protein content in general. But it seemed like with that one, and I would like to remember back to that brew day. It's been a little while, but it seemed like that was a pretty clean boil too. Like the low protein content was enough that what came together fast, and there wasn't as much as the usual egg drop soup I might get from like a Environment or something like that.
Austin, who didn't want to stick around tonight because he's not a team player, wanted us to know that it is here now. So
We do have a lot of IREX in the grand room.
If
I didn't
you-
know how much, but we do have
if
some.
you
We have
shop
about 5
here,
pallets of it.
yeah,
There
if
it
you
is.
shop here and you're not buying that malt, you're crazy. The next beer you make, you should use IREX
Ask for
malt.
the IREX, yeah.
Yeah, it's my favorite base malt I've ever used. That's the only thing I'm going to use for my English beers, for everything. Their pale malt is really fantastic. The Pilsner malt, I tend to think that there's not a lot of deviation between Pilsner malts. You can use a Belgian or a German or whatever, and they taste very, very similar. But here's one aspect where IREX is completely different. And the very low protein, I love the really, really clear wort you get out of it. When I'm running off, I have 15-gallon kettles. when I'm running off, I'm at 5 gallons. I can still see the bottom of my kettle.
Right.
Wow.
It's really clear. Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. So if your goal is to have very clear beer, starting off with clear wort is obviously a good way to go. And that might be something that if you're looking for something to try and take your beer to the next step. I've got everything like dialed in like I want, but I wish this would come out clearer. You might look at what kind of base malts you're using, and then also the pH. Greg talked about that. pH is something that I've hit on in the last year because I was having efficiency issues, and I noticed that there was one beer that I brewed that I put acidulated malt in. I just seemed to get much better efficiency, and darker beers I normally got better efficiency. And I thought, I bet there's some sort of pH issue, and I measured, and sure enough there was. And now that I correct that with every batch, I get much better efficiency, much clearer beer. Everything seems to come out better when you make sure that pH is correct.
That was definitely something I noticed when I started out. I started out with darker beers and got much higher efficiency with them. And then I started transitioning to lighter beers, lighter colored beers, and the efficiency dropped off, and I couldn't figure out why initially.
That's probably why. So we've talked about pH meters and that kind of thing in the past, and it's something that, again, you're checking things off your list. You may not be to the point where that's something that you feel is a priority to worry about, but when you get to that point, it's something worth looking at because it affects your beer in a lot of different ways, and clarity is one of them. And then the fast chilling is another one, depending on how you chill.
Right. And I think that mainly what you're looking for is to get a quick, 20 minutes or so. Within 20 minutes, you should be able to get the cold break that you want. A lot of times people can get it down faster than that. If you're doing this in the sink, you're going to have to work pretty hard to get it down in 20 minutes to get the best cold break out of it with ice in the sink. But you can, as long as you're stirring it and changing the water and whatnot, you can get it down there pretty fast.
If you're a serious brewer, you should have some sort of cooling apparatus.
You should, yeah.
Whether it's an immersion chiller or a plate chiller or a counterflow or something like that. And honestly, if you're doing ice baths in your sink, you're spending enough money on ice that it doesn't take long to pay for an immersion chiller.
It would be worth having.
Like it's one of the reasons I went from a plate chiller to a counterflow chiller because our water being so warm here. Running through a plate chiller one time, I was only getting down to 105 or something like that. And you're not getting good cold break. Or if you do get cold break, like in the winter when the groundwater's nice and cold, that cold break does not do well in a plate chiller because they're small channels and it kind of clogs it up. So I went to the counterflow so I could recirculate through it and whirlpool and get it down to 100 or so before I finally ran off. And that leaves a bunch of that stuff in the kettle. And not only does that help with clarity, it helps with stability too. There's staling agents that are in that trube and that cold break that drops out. So that's something that you should take a look at. If you're an advanced brewer, you should have your chilling techniques down
fast,
down very good. Yeah,
as cold as you can get it as quickly as possible. It's going to get you the best cold break, and then letting that settle out before you transfer. Of course, that'd be the next best thing. And that also brings us to cold crashing, which is something that people do on both sides of the process, right after the hot side and then right after fermentation as well. Like I know for sure that Pete's the type that when he gets his beer, he'll let it sit overnight in his cooler to let it all fall out, basically cold crashing it, keeping it at a certain temperature range, a lower part of the fermentation range, say 60 maybe, 58, and then he'll take that out, transfer it into another container that's been sitting out, so it's going to warm up a little bit as it transfers, and then he pitches. Therefore, he's got a lot more of a clear beer going in to start and initially, and see, I'm not that particular about it, but it definitely has made some great beers. So, I mean, even beers that we both brewed together, I think he's done that, and I think it came out a little cleaner than whatever I did. Maybe mine had more of a muddy edge to it in the end. His did not. That's the kind of stuff that we're talking about with that.
You could cold crash on the front end.
That's what I'm saying. It's like
you could do that.
Just think about the fact of whenever you're going to go pitch afterwards, you don't want it to be too cold, or else you're going to take a while to heat it up. That's the main thing. You like letting it settle overnight.
Pitching temperatures are cool enough to drop that stuff out. You don't have to get it cold. You just have to get it to 65.
Yeah,
and that stuff will just settle right out. It's
overnight.
Big,
it's
big,
still going to
heavy,
drop.
It's not powdery stuff.
That's typically when you watch people transfer. They're not transferring really clear wort. You're not seeing a carboy full of really clear stuff right off the bat. But you will see a very clear wort if you try it that way. If you do that method and then go to pitch. But you're just going to have to use 2 containers. You have to transfer it again. You know,
the other way to do that, and I know Carl King does this, is up your batch size by a gallon or 2.
Right.
So if you want 5 gallons, make 6.5 gallons or something like that. And instead of using your ball valve or pouring or whatever, put an auto siphon in there and siphon off the top and leave all that stuff in the bottom. That's how Carl King does it.
Let it settle out.
Let
cold.
it settle out, yeah, while you're chilling, and just siphon off the top and just leave some behind. And that's another way to get really clear and not have to go back the next day and transfer to another container and all that stuff.
So there are a lot of ways in order to get to that point. But then after the process is the other part of it, which this is that where it's had yeast in it. It's gone through fermentation. There's a lot of trub from that. You definitely want, if you want to get started with something, especially if you're kegging, then go straight to cold crashing afterwards. Have a space to be able to drop that down to about 34, 35 degrees over a couple of days.
Yeah.
Things are going to fall right out. And then when you transfer that beer, it's going to be crystal clear. And it also is going to make a lot of finings work better where you can add them to the process in this. But just to start, that's going to make a huge difference. Plus, when you go into a keg,
makes a big difference. It does.
It's going to make you able to carbonate that beer at a much faster rate than you normally would. So, like the fast carbonation method works a lot better on a cold beer like that. So,
well, it'll only work on a cold beer. CO2 really will not dissolve into a warm beer. It's got to be cold.
A beer that is typically chilling over time, it takes longer in that process than it would, say, going right in cold.
Right, but I mean, if you're trying to do the fast carbonation, if you're going to do the shake method or something like that, that won't work without being cold.
Right.
It's not going to dissolve into solution. It's got to be cold. So even if it takes you a couple or a few extra days to cold crash, remember, you're gaining a day of that back on the carbonation side if you're kegging, because the instant you put it in, CO2's starting to dissolve into it, rather than waiting for that to cool down before it works. So, Zach, where are we at time-wise?
You're at 49 minutes.
49 minutes. Do we want to get into these finding agents before the break or after the break?
That's up to y'all.
Go half and half.
I mean, typically, as far as these go, I think we've covered a lot of the ground of what the best approach to this, and now you get in the point of actually adding the finding agents. You know, so.
And these are when you talk about finding on the cold side, so before you package, basically, but after your fermentation and boil and all that stuff, you're talking about taking it to a completely different level of clarity, in my experience. When I've used about 3 or 4 of the different finding agents on here, and it's the difference between a pretty clear beer and an absolutely crystal clear beer.
Yes.
And in competition, if you have, say, like a cream ale is supposed to be brilliantly clear. If you don't use a finding agent in a cream ale, you're shooting yourself in the foot, I think. It's one of those things that just gives it that extra little bit that they're going to look for in competition. When you're trying to check off every box for competition, I think you really need to be looking at using cold side finding agents.
So should the finding agents be done after a cold crash, ideally?
Well, yes.
It could be done during, but the colder the wort, whenever, or the finished beer, typically, the first one on our list is gelatin. Yeah, that's the most common, I think.
That's the one I use on a regular basis. It's very easy. It's very inexpensive. It works great. From what I've read, your beer has to be cold. You need to get it into the 30s.
Start cold
for it to work. I've never used it warm. I've been told by people they've used it warm and it worked. But everything I've read has said get it cold, so I've always done it that way. I get my beer down to 34, 35 degrees, and the formula for it is, let's see, one half to a teaspoon per 5 gallon batch. Right. I go to the store, I get the Knorr unflavored gelatin.
Yeah, the unflavored, which one?
I use a packet.
Cherry Jello or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't use cherry Jello.
So, but yeah, unflavored. It doesn't take that much. You put that in.
You buy a box of it and you use 1 pack for a 5 gallon batch. It's real simple. That's why I buy it, because
or less. Yeah, I mean.
So walk us through the process. In the secondary, you add this.
Secondary, cold crashed.
Once it is cold crashed and you're ready to keg, you want to take a packet of this, or if you're buying it in bulk or in the little jars like we've got it here at the shop, you use a half to 1 teaspoon. Get some water warm. You don't want to get it boiling. If you get it boiling, you're going to set the pectins that are in there, and it's not going to work right. So
about 160 tops.
Yeah, 160 tops. I don't even get it that warm. I'm in the 140-ish range.
Usually, like a lot of people they mix it together and put it in the microwave, hit it like for 15-second bouts, mix it, check it with a gauge, see what's going on.
See, I
with
get the water hot
thermometer.
first. I get the water to the temperature I want it first before I ever put the gelatin in.
And
so I
I've
make
done
sure I
it
don't
both
get too
ways and
hot. Yeah.
found it to be
Yeah.
fine. I just build it up a little bit by a little bit. And just as long as you don't go too far, because you don't really want it to turn into what it
Into
would
Jell-O.
turn in
Yeah,
when it
yeah.
when it boils. So, and then you have your container. You just pitch it in. I
Yeah.
mean, let it do its thing when you pitch it in. You're not really even mixing that up or anything like
So
that.
you don't
so.
stir it in, you just drop it
Pitch
around.
I
in.
just take it and kind of sprinkle it into the
Yeah.
like
Okay.
you're pitching yeast basically. And what
Circle eights.
a very rudimentary explanation of it is that it's positively charged and yeast
Right.
is negatively charged or the reverse of that.
Okay.
And so they attract to each other, and so it just the gelatin's going to settle to the bottom, and then it attracts the yeast to it all on the bottom. And you'll notice when you clean your fermenter out, it's a very tight, it's a
Yes.
jello-y
You'll
yeast
see
cake.
that layer.
You're not going to be able to use your yeast cake again, but I never do anyway.
If you do it in the primary, which is not the best idea because of what that entails, you'll see the layer
Yeah.
of that gelatin on top of the yeast cake. Just know that even though that's there, if you move it around too much, it's still going to stir stuff up again, and then
Yeah.
you're going to pull it out. And people will do this in their kegs too, like Zach mentioned. I think that while that's not a terrible idea, and it obviously works, you still run the risk of shaking that keg up and then stirring what's in the bottom of that back in solution.
Well, the other
So-
thing too is you have to trim your dip tube if you're going to do it in your keg. You
Right,
can't use a standard
right.
dip tube.
Oh,
You've
yeah.
got to cut about 1 inch off the bottom. I personally don't care for that idea, so I've never done it in the keg.
Yeah, I don't like it either, so I haven't
But
tried
I
it.
will say that gelatin, in my experience, works really well.
It does.
It's really easy. It's really inexpensive.
And it doesn't strip out too much flavor, which is
No, it
something that
doesn't.
can happen with the finings. Is that like if you say you make a double IPA, this is something that it can take some of the flavor could drop out of it. If it's something that needs a little more yeast character, but you still want it to be brilliantly clear, it might pull a little bit of that flavor out of it too. If you're using a fining, and you're not just letting the bottles actually sit and let everything drop out over time, because time is the
Right.
other element. That's your
Right.
other option. So
So the other one would be isinglass.
another collagen.
If you've ever seen this completely bullshit article that goes around Facebook every few months about 5 beers you should stop drinking immediately or whatever, and one of them says Guinness has fish bladders or some crap in it. What they're talking about is isinglass. Isinglass is derived from fish bladders. Lots of brewers use it. It's been used for centuries. It's actually a pretty commonly used commercial fining because it works really, really well. The reason it's bullshit is that it doesn't stay in your beer. There's not fish bladders in your beer. They derive it from a substance found in fish bladders. You put it in, it drops to the bottom, they take it out, and all that's left is the beer. So that drives me crazy when I see that.
And even if that was true, as I recall, collagen's actually really good for your hair, nails. and
Yeah,
skin.
that's a good point. Yeah, isinglass is collagen, just extracted from fish bladders. It works really well. It's a little more expensive than gelatin. You're going to buy it
Right.
in pouches. It's just a clear liquid in a pouch. And what's it, a couple bucks?
Oh, yeah,
or
it's
something
cheap.
like that.
It's
so
cheap.
it's pretty cheap, but it's less
It's cheap,
readily available.
It's commonly
and-
used.
yeah.
It's just a little bit different than what
Yeah.
gelatin is, Another animal, they're both animal products, though. So if that's your problem with it, then you're still using an animal product either way.
Personally, I think you should intentionally put it in your beer and give it to a vegan and then slap them in the face. So.
But yeah, the only thing that I've read a couple of times, and I sort of doubt it because it's been used so long and whatnot, is that if there were some people with really serious shellfish allergies might have some sort of reaction, but even that seems sort of hesitant. That seems more like it might come from a home brew that got mixed up and some of it stayed in solution in that that packaged beverage, But
What about the gout? What if you have the gout?
the gout, huh?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Tell us
No-
about having
no
the gout
clue.
and we'll find out.
Just curious. Oh.
Do you have the gout?
No, I don't. And not that I know of.
I think the beer itself is going to have more of an effect on the gout than the
the
fish
alcohol.
bladders are. Yeah, the collagen. The advantage to isinglass is that it's really easy to use. You buy a pouch of it, you cut the corner off, you put it
Pour
in
it
cold
in.
beer,
5,
and
6
in a
gallons.
couple days, it's clear. I mean, and it works great. So that's another one I would highly recommend. The other one would be Cheeto San or
Kisasol.
Kiesel
Sol, I
Yeah.
It's a two-parter, isn't it?
Yeah, Dual Fine is
Yeah.
is one that has both of these. Again, it's like another. This one's just a double pack, both liquid.
Yeah, and I've used this one before. You'll typically find it in wine kits.
Yeah,
Actually.
it's more used for wine than
Yeah.
not. So.
I'm not sure why.
We
it's
actually
more
have
used for
a
that.
blog that Austin wrote that's about findings for wine, and this is one of the primary ones in that. So
This worked very well too. In my opinion, it was about the same outcome as Isinglass, and it's a little more expensive and a little more complicated because you're going to put, if I remember correctly, you put the Kiesel Sol in first, and a
12
couple
to
days
24
later
hours
you put the
before.
which
you put the Cheeto San in.
yeah, and you've got one that's positively charged, and the other one is negatively charged because the silica is going to be negatively charged,
Okay.
while the Cheeto San is going to be positive. So basically, what you're getting is a double reaction to pull as much as you can out
Okay.
of solution. Because the negative is going to help pull out more of the polyphenols, whereas the positive is going to help pull out more of the yeast and protein content. So
This worked very well when I used it too. To be honest with you, I gotta think that there's a reason that it's used more often in wine. That maybe there's something in wine that's more difficult to pull out.
This is about beer, Brandon.
Yeah, for beer, I don't know that it's worth the extra
Hey,
expense.
wine
Right,
people are
right.
home brewers too, okay?
Yeah, see, I'm not really sure on the wine side of things. Sometimes I think it's just a practice thing that's the industry that also came into home brewing, the home side of everything.
Well,
But-
yeah, that's a good point, and it might be something that on the pro side where they end up with more like pieces of skin and particulate and
Right.
that kind of thing. That it might help more with that. I'm just guessing.
Easily
I really don't know,
packaged.
but-
I mean, like I don't include bentonite in here, but that's something that goes with the wine as well.
Mhm.
You don't really see that used in beer because of it's clay.
Okay.
It's a similar, it's meant to help finding the end product, but we're not going to use that in beer. This sort of translates because it's a lot like isinglass. Plus, we also use some of the silica products in this, and that's, it's both in this state. So, and the Cheeto Sen's actually made from shellfish, so that could be
A
something
little
to
closer
consider
to
as well.
reactionary.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if there's something for you. But
But would there be enough to actually be categorized as having it in it?
good question. If you're allergic to those kind of things, before you use those products, do a little research and find out how it might affect you more so, because we cannot make a health statement as such.
Yeah.
We are not doctors. Brandon pretends to be on television and in his normal life.
Yes, and at home. It doesn't work ever. For 20 years, it hasn't worked. So the next one would be Polyclar, which is for polyvinyl polypyrrolidine.
PVPP.
Did I say that right?
Polyvinyl
know.
polypyrrol. Yeah,
Pyrrolidine? Yeah,
I
okay.
think so.
I've never used this before.
I have not either.
I've never
It's-
heard of it.
It's saying that it can reduce color and hop bitterness if overused. Again, I think this is just one of those you mix it with some water and throw
Yep.
it in.
Powder,
I've
typically.
heard of it before. I don't know anybody that uses it. I've never used it, so I can't really
It's
speak
going to
to
be
its
more of the negative
effectiveness.
charge again. Polyphenols, tannins are going to be pulled out. It's also going to pull out the protein and yeast. I mean, it's positive charge in this one, but it's good also for the removals due to being, I guess, the polymer base of this is, I think, the thing with the PVPP on the polyclar that it helps pull out all of them. So it's a good finding agent. It's just not a natural. I don't know if you can say that's not a natural product, but it's just a different type of product.
Well, it
So-
says polyvinyl, and it says it's polymer based. That
Yeah,
makes me think
polymer
it's
based.
not natural. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
Not quite.
so-
I'm not sure where I guess it's completely man-made. I'm not sure. So.
Now, the next one is a really interesting one to me. I don't remember who. I think Mikey was going to do an experiment with this. Silica gels, and the one in particular is White Labs Clarity Firm, this is something that's just come about in the last couple
And
years.
it's not
That's something that
advertised
I've been
as
wanting to
that.
use.
Not advertised as a silica gel or
But that's
something
what it-
that's a
but
finding
that's what it
agent or
is.
whatever. So, but it is.
Well,
what
it is advertised as a finding agent, but
It's
what-
really advertised as the gluten remover.
well, that's
Yeah.
the other effect to it is that it removes a great deal of gluten from it to the point where they're saying that the vast majority of people who have gluten sensitivity, real gluten sensitivity, not imagined gluten
Yeah.
sensitivity, they can drink beer that this is made with.
As I recall, for it, it actually removes enough to be labeled for a
To
beer
be-
to be labeled as gluten free.
Yeah, you're right about
low
that.
Amount of it.
Yeah, it's like what is it, 11 parts per million or something like that of gluten.
I think 20.
Is it
might be-
20? Yeah,
might
I
be
think you might be
11, though.
right. I
don't
think
know.
it's 20.
I think it's 20 though.
I think that's what I remember hearing is that
It's
20 is the
20 parts per
threshold,
million.
and this takes it to like 11,
Yeah.
or something like that to be considered gluten free.
Gluten-free,
Yeah.
And I've been trying to remember to add this because you're supposed to add it at fermentation in
Oh,
order
really?
for it to work.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
And
that.
I bought some and then went, damn it. I have to make another batch of beer to try this now.
So I know that Mikey has a friend who's gluten sensitive or maybe even celiac, that he was going to make a batch with this and try it. I don't know how it came out. He was listening earlier. Maybe he'll chime in. But I know that I have heard interviews with people that have used it that said it works great.
Yeah,
That it does exactly what it says it does. So
without having a lot of effect, I mean, on changing any kind of flavor or anything else of that, you still get a great beer out of it, but you've just reduced the gluten greatly. And then people who have any true sensitivity usually aren't as affected by it, if at all.
yeah.
So,
The other thing, I like what you just said, Chris, that you put it in during fermentation or
Yeah,
before
it's
fermentation.
During fermentation is what it says on the package.
I like that idea. It basically removes a step. You know, you're not having to, okay, it's fermented, now I've cold crashed it, now I'm going to fine it, then I'm going to package it. If you're doing it during fermentation, it removes a step. That alone would be a reason for me to buy that.
And
Is
it's a really small thing. It's only like
small vial.
yeah, it's like 3 milliliters or something
Right.
like that.
Right.
very
It's
small
easy to
amount.
overlook that packaging in
Yeah.
the shop where we've had it, and a lot of people haven't seen it. It's been like right here next to the yeast, you know.
Yeah.
Does it say anything else about using further findings on that package? Do you remember?
I don't
I
remember.
didn't
it
read that
saying
before we
anything
started this.
Other than that, it didn't recommend a yeast to be used with. It just says
Add during fermentation. Primary. Okay.
And-
One of the things it says here is it's good for polyphenol reduction, which to me that would be a good one to use on very hoppy beers,
Right.
because that
To get the
that's just an
brilliant
issue.
clarity,
Yeah, the
yet
brilliant
retain
clarity,
the-
or at least close. you
Right.
know. So that
For
can be a
a good
difficult
West
thing.
Coast IPA. Should be
Yes.
nice, bright, clear, all the way through, but you get all
The
that
way
hop
the Lord
character.
intended. When Jesus handed us down the IPA the West Coast IPA as a style, he
It
said,
shall be clear.
"It shall be clear." And that brings us to filtering, because when you drink
final.
those nice clear West Coast IPAs, the vast majority of them are filtered.
Yes, they are.
That's an entirely different challenge, especially with hoppy beers. Because,
Which you will lose some of the character.
yeah. Professional brewers will tell you that they over hop because the physical filtration pulls hop flavor out of the beer.
Right, and which is pretty much what most pro breweries do, is they use a filter system
Yeah.
over refining agents.
Yeah.
Some of them do both. Some of them use one or the other, but typically you're going to find a filter that when you go to a brewery and you see that what looks like a big silver bullet basically sitting there, that's usually the filter system, and or it's or what is that, using the what's it,
Yeah, diatomaceous earth, the
diatomaceous
DE.
earth,
Yeah.
Or
Which is the
they
same
have
thing
like
you use in your pool filter.
a multi-filter like setup. Like here we do a lot of different stage filters, different micron levels, and then what they do is they force it through with pressure, right? And that's
Yeah.
the same thing you would do at home. Like you can buy a kit here. You're going to pour the beer into a container. You're going to pressurize it to push it through one size micron filter. You're going to start with the larger micron and move to the smaller. Typically,
There's
I think
typically
it's like
3 steps, right?
it's 2 to 3.
2 to 3?
Two to
Yeah,
three.
okay.
If you do 2, you're getting almost everything out of it. 3 might push it to the point.
The
like-
last one is what's called a sanitary filter.
Yeah.
So it's stripping out every last little
Yeah.
thing that's in there. And generally, when you do this at home, you're going to do it from keg to keg.
Yeah.
So think about how much work that is.
Yeah, and
You're going to
it's
keg
like a
this,
lot of work
pressurize
for
it,
brewing.
run it through a filter into another keg, get another keg, pressurize it, run it through the filter into
Right.
that other keg, and then get another keg and pressurize this and run it through. I mean, that's a lot of work.
they have that. They have like little tanks you can do it with too. But just think about with beer, especially oxidation is an issue.
Yeah.
The more oxidant exposure you have, and you're pushing it around, it's foaming and whatnot.
Well, that's why
You can
people
keep
do
it
it
all
with
under-
kegs.
yeah,
Is you got to
all
keep it
under
as a closed
CO2,
transfer.
so,
Yeah.
I don't imagine that being very practical on the homebrew side.
Right.
People
right.
do it.
Maybe for wine,
lot of-
it would be more practical.
We have plenty of customers who have their own setups for it,
Oh, yeah.
and they come in and they get it, but it's mostly geared towards wine. When you buy
Mm.
a kit from something, it's geared towards wine. So
Okay.
I think before you even consider doing that, try several of these fining options we talked about,
Yeah.
and I think you'll
Yeah.
find that
Absolutely.
they work really well.
you won't
And
need
I-
a filter.
The work of opening a package and dumping it in a fermenter, or cleaning
waiting.
out 5 kegs and all that
Yeah.
crap. I mean, I'll dump stuff in a fermenter any day
Yeah.
instead. So
Which is something too, even if you did all of that and you're really, really particular about it, you got 2 kegs, you did all the fining, you cold crashed, you transferred to a secondary after primary, then you cold crashed that, and then you transferred to a keg, or cold crashed that, added finings, then transferred to a keg with, say, a short dip tube on it. You could then jump that to another keg just to make sure that whatever fell out of that over time is now gone from that batch, and it's only one clean keg, and you're done.
And it would still
If
be
you're
less
really-
work than filtering.
Yes, really, really particular. You still get a long way with just that. So I mean,
And,
you did what you needed.
Kenny's got a question on Facebook asking if he doesn't have the ability to cold crash yet. How can he still make his beer clear?
Time, and I think some of the fining agents are still going to work for what you need on that, but really transferring from the primary to the secondary after primary fermentation is complete, as in complete too. You can give it a week or two really, and then transfer that secondary. If you can keep it in the coolest spot that you can, add in some fining agents.
Remember too, you can cold crash in a bottle. If you don't have a space to cold crash, that makes me think you're still bottling. Once it's carbonated, if you refrigerate that for 2 weeks, it's pretty much the same thing as crashing it in a secondary. Now you're going to have to pour carefully. It's going to be a bottle conditioned beer, obviously, with some stuff in the bottom, but just keeping it refrigerated, and people who bottle will notice that their last beers that have been cold for a while are clearer than their first beers. It's the same type of thing.
And that's something when we touch on this as like a final note too. If you were doing that, like we said, if you pre-bottling, if you just had it, room temp and whatnot, and you let it settle out over time, the longer you take before bottling, possibly the less viable your yeast are.
Yeah.
So even if you got a really nice, clear, finished beer, you might want to use something like the CBC1 dry yeast or something. You'll add it the day before, let it rehydrate in there, then go to bottling bucket.
It's a very good point.
Because you're still going to have, no matter what, if you're bottle conditioning, you're always going to have trub in the bottom. So once you finish, it's going to be in there. There's no getting around that. There's just no way to get around that.
And the
get
CBC
carbonation.
yeast that you recommended is a great option for that,
It's another
that
English,
stuff does drop out.
Cask yeast.
Yeah, and pack on the bottom in a nice compact little cake down there. So
exactly.
That's one thing. If you're finding that when you bottle condition that it's tough to keep that yeast at the bottom from rousing, what Greg just said is probably a great
CBC1.
Yeah,
waiting for that. Using that after, even if you had to, if you got everything to fall out before you went to bottling, go ahead and use that because you're guaranteed to have a good bottle conditioned beer, and it's going to drop and be compact, especially once you've had it in the fridge for a while. And then when you pour it, don't pour that last ounce or so. Stop the pour.
Yeah.
You're going to learn where to stop the pour once you've done a few of them, but stop the pour. Don't shake it up. Keep it stable when you're moving it around, especially if you want to serve it to somebody else.
Don't
just
drink
throw
it
it to
from
them.
the bottle.
Yeah, don't drink it from the bottle, and don't, if you can help it when you're transferring it, don't shake it too much. I mean, because it's hard to put something like that in a cooler and not shake it up.
Yeah.
Or if you have to, let it settle out over time. It's the same with a keg. If you know that there's going to be some stuff shaking up, get it as cold as you can and let it sit for a while before it's served. So, and you'll get that clear beer again. So.
All right, well, very good. We're going to go ahead and take a break now because we ran pretty long here. We're going to come back and talk about some Belgian styles, blondes, and singles, beers that do not cause my Uber rating to drop, like the triples did last week. I'm blaming it on the triples. But before we go, we want to remind you to go to patreon.com/Come and Brew It Radio and check out ways that you can help support the show. We've got quite a few people doing that now. Every little bit helps. It could be as little as, $2 a month can help us out. And, this is expensive to keep going, and we love doing it. We want to keep on doing it so we can use any support that you can give us. So please go there and check it out and help us out.
And remember
if you
that
can.
the 10 and 20s, they actually get one of the special Come and Brew It work shirts that we've been working on. So you'll have something special with that one.
Ah, the legendary,
that
mythical.
Yes, mythical.
Yes.
Like a unicorn.
So we will drink some beer and talk real loud, and we'll be back in a little bit.
Hooray.
Yay.